What's up, guys? This is Jay Griff. Welcome to the 13th and final episode of the Dark Souls 2 Blog of Pain. So, this is going to be my final statements on Dark Souls 2 as a game, focusing on the difficulty, the controls, and the overall dynamics of it. And I'm going to start with the dynamics because Dark Souls 2, it's a great game, but if you put it side by side with its predecessors, Dark Souls and Demon's Souls before that, it doesn't quite stack up, but it does win out in a few ways. It's not a clear cut. It's worse. Period. It's worse in certain ways. I think that are more critical. In the dynamics of combat, Dark Souls is mostly about timing. It's about when to strike, when to block, when to dodge, and when to throw everything at the wall and just go blow for blow with the enemy, hoping that you'll do more damage than him and he'll die first. Features like the adaptability stat and healing over time with your Estus Flask. They changed things a lot because suddenly your rolls were slower than they used to be. They didn't go as far. They didn't do as much for you. Drinking your Estus Flask was really, really slow all of a sudden. Healing took a long time as opposed to the near instant effect you had before, but it also couldn't be interrupted. You would keep healing even as you took hits, and it would go back down and go up. And even raising your shield was a lot slower than before. It used to be pretty fucking quick, pretty snappy, and in Dark Souls 2, it's actually pretty slow. So this would make you a lot more cautious, a lot more methodic than before. At least you would think that. But the enemies are generally weaker, and soul levels fly at you left and right. You are going to level up like crazy compared to the other games. So you end up being so much more powerful than you would have been that they kind of negate that whole effect of them wanting you to be a little more cautious, because you can honestly take way more risks in 2 than you could in 1. The slow shield raising more than anything else, though. I mean, that doesn't really add anything to the combat. I think that detracts from it, because what it ends up doing is when you don't raise your shield fast enough because of that delay, you end up feeling cheated if you die. You don't feel like, oh, I should have, you know, been I should have been quicker on the pull for that, because usually you're as quick on it as fucking possible because you're up in the enemy's face and you've just finished an attack and hit the button immediately to start blocking, and it doesn't matter because it's too slow and you end up taking a hit. You're going to feel more cheated than anything else a lot, especially when an enemy surprises you. They pulled all the invincibility or the iframes out. Well, not all of them, but they pulled a lot of them out. And I don't think that did the game any good. By removing so many of the invincibility frames from your roll, what it did was it didn't make you better at rolling. It made you stop rolling. It discourages rolling as a tactic, unless you're going to go straight back. No longer are you going to have the highly acrobatic, highly dynamic fights with things, because your roll is just going to get you killed now all of a sudden. It's not your ally. And but worse than that, it allowed you to take damage during animations, which used to be impossible. When you started an animation, it was full invincibility frames. That's not the case anymore, which can lead to you, while your character's doing something, pulling a switch. He can take a cheap shot from an enemy that you probably maybe didn't know was there or couldn't see before you approached that switch. And worse, you can take damage when you're backstabbing someone. So you enter into the backstab animation and you're doing huge damage to one character, and the other enemies can still hurt you. Not for the whole thing, but for a part of it, and it used to be the entire thing you were invincible. So you can actually die because you pulled off what's supposed to be a hard and rewarding thing. That's not good. They also changed the threshold for gear as far as what it did to your rolling, because in DS1 it was 25% of your equipment load you fast rolled, up to 50 you were medium rolling, and over 50, you were fat rolling. It was really slow and it sucked. They changed the threshold for fat rolling. It's at 70%. There's no hard line in between there. It's faster and it's longer the lower you have it. Which would seem cool because it would encourage you to wear more gear. It would encourage you to wear heavier, some of the cooler equipment. But then they fucked that up by linking it to another stat. They linked it to vitality, which used to be your health. Now your health is controlled by vigor, and you gain a tiny bit of health for every other stat as well. But now you've got this vitality stat that is a standalone stat just for your equipment burden, which used to be tied to the endurance stat. So every time you gained more endurance, so you could do more actions, you would gain the ability to wear heavier equipment. Now you got to level an extra stat just to wear more stuff, which sucks. It's a throwaway stat kinda. It's annoying. But moving on. I've already talked about the really bad collision detection issues that can happen in this game, particularly with the Smelter Demon and the Pursuer, both of which are bosses. So it's really not where you want it to happen. But it's not super common, but it can happen, and when it does happen, you feel really cheated. So all that said, some of the things they got right was that they made it real easy for you to get your hands on more miracles and more spells earlier on in the game than you could in Dark Souls 1. And they introduced items that replenish spell usage, which straight up didn't exist in Dark Souls 1. You had to go to a bonfire to get your spells back, so everything respawned. That was the trade-off. But now you can there are consumable items that can give you spells back. And I actually think that's a good design decision. It makes it maybe a little easier, but what I think it really did was it encouraged players to play the caster classes. It wasn't just the realm of people who were extremely good. Now anybody, could approach a caster class and not immediately get their teeth kicked in. Especially miracles. Miracles were not a viable way to play the game in Dark Souls 1. They were a supplement. But now you can make a complete miracle build, and it's pretty beastly. My last point about the dynamics of the game is that you can warp between the bonfires from the very beginning of the game. Any bonfire you light, you can then warp to it from any other bonfire. Now, in Dark Souls 1, you could do that with the Lord Vessel. You could warp between bonfires, but only after you got the Lord Vessel, which is after my favorite boss fight, Smough and Ornstein, which is about halfway through the game. And even once you've got it, while you can warp away from any bonfire now, you can't warp to just any bonfire. It's only specific ones. So, with that being in the game from the very beginning and it having no limit, the player never experiences the fear that comes from being in the back of a really tough area and having no way to get out except to go right back the way they came. Now they can always go to a bonfire and just escape. There's no getting into Blighttown, which was a fucking bitch. Going through the depths, going into Blighttown, fighting your way through all of that crap, reaching the bottom, and knowing, okay, I finally made it. I'm finally in Blighttown, and guess what? There's no friggin' way back out of here except back up one of the ways you can get in, and they're both really difficult. So you beat Quelaag, you're on top of the world, you rung the second bell, and shit. It's a long road back up, isn't it? In Dark Souls 2, they never experience that. You never have to be very strategic with how you're navigating through the areas. You never have to say, like, can I avoid using a bonfire so that things don't respawn? Like, can I survive that long? Even though several times I avoided using bonfires because I didn't need to use them, but that's about the difficulty. You never have to make that sort of decision because, yeah, I'll just rest at the bonfire and I'm out. Back in Majula. Whatever. From the very beginning of the game. They shouldn't have done that. Like, it needs to be in the game because the games are really big, and walking back and forth between all the areas, especially at the end of the game when you need to get certain things from certain places, that gets super tedious. But when you're still building the game up, when you're still ratcheting up the tension, you really want characters and players to know that when they're in an area, it's for keeps. You can't just, you know, warp back out. You gotta fight your way in. You gotta fight your way out. It's part of the experience, and I think it diminished Dark Souls 2 in a lot of ways by making it easier, essentially. So now, let's move on to the controls. You remember my first vlog? How unhyped I was, how loose and crappy the controls felt, and then how quickly that pretty much wore off? Well, after I've picked up Demon's Souls, now I played Dark Souls, Dark Souls 1, or Dark Souls 2, and Demon's Souls. I can tell you that Dark Souls 2 has far and away the least responsive controls of the 3 games in the Soul series. You can get used to them very quickly because the game is built around them. It's built for those controls. It's not like it's built for the other control systems, but it's not nearly as sharp. It's not nearly as fast. It's not nearly as precise as those other games. If you go from Dark Souls 2 back into either of the other ones, you notice it immediately. You're like, these controls are fucking tight. These are good. Those Dark Souls 2 controls kind of suck, don't they? Yeah, they do. Especially when you start getting control lag, where when you're just jamming on a button for him to do something and he's just standing there. And worse, when a couple of seconds go by and you're walking around and then out of nowhere he'll roll because you told him to roll like 10 seconds ago and it just now made it into the system. That's rare, but it's a quirk that a lot of people have noticed and that I have definitely experienced, and it really sucks when it rears its head. That's all I've got to say about the controls, though, really. I mean, they're solid enough for the game, but compared to what came before, they're not as good. So, difficulty. The most infamous and most important thing about the Souls series is the difficulty. And I can say that Dark Souls 2, without a doubt, is the easiest of the Souls games, but is very far from being an easy game. It is still a very difficult game, but it's not as brutally punishing as its predecessors. It's less unfair to certain builds. It is more conducive of any build completing the game, whereas Dark Souls 1 could really shut pure melee and pure caster builds down hard in certain areas of the game. By offering these options, by making pretty much anything viable in any situation, they've made it less of a thinking man's game because you have to suddenly you can tackle everything. There's nothing in the game that you would have to strategically avoid. There was a lot of that in the other ones. You would have to pick and choose your battles and kind of find your way around things, and there was usually a way to be found. You had to find it. Sometimes that way was co-op, but I mean, I played the other two. There's no one playing Demon's Souls anymore, so there's no one to summon. And Dark Souls 1, PC, games for Windows Live, I'm in permanent offline mode now, which is fine. But, yeah, now, it's still hard. If you make too many mistakes, it's still over, and it's over shockingly fast sometimes. And I've already talked about the Dragon Boss. That's fucking outstanding. But, I mean, items are way easier to amass in Dark Souls 2. Because not only are there more of them and they're everywhere, but souls are easy to farm. Way easier to farm. You will never hurt for souls in Dark Souls 2, which means you can always go buy a ton of whatever you need. Dark Souls 1, even buying ammunition, if you tried to make a ranged build, which heaven help you if you actually tried to make that work. Like, just buying ammo, the first time you go up to a merchant, you're like, yeah, let's buy some arrows, and shit, I guess I'll have like 5 shots. And that's it. or I'll buy these super cheap arrows that do no damage. Like none. Zero. Okay. They made it a lot easier by just throwing souls at you left and right. It's crazy. But most importantly about the game that led to it being easier but also led to it being more fun is the co-op. The co-op in Dark Souls 2 is absolutely phenomenal. There is way more uh, cooperative play going on in this one than there ever was in the other two, which were like Invasion City, population your ass. Invasions are really rare in Dark Souls 2. They still play by the rule that you have to be in human form to be invaded, but it's still pretty infrequent unless you go into the Belfries. And if you're part of the Belfry Covenants and you're watching this, you're a terrible human being and you should stop doing it. But invasions, they have to use a consumable item that is not very common to enter your world. So invasions, which used to be free, whatever, let's do it, they're pretty rare. And usually the invader is a very, very strong player. I'm yet to run into anyone who's blatantly cheating. Part of that is that I'm on a console. When I played Dark Souls 1 online on the PC, I was invaded nonstop, and every single person, almost, I think one guy invaded that was cheating in one way or another. They had some sort of invincibility or some sort of unlimited something that they would just throw at me endlessly when it's supposed to be a 1 to 2 charge thing. So the co-op really saved Dark Souls 2. Jolly cooperation. It made the game so much more fun. It was great. I love it. Okay, so overall, I think it's a great place to start for new players. If you're new to the series, it's a great starting point. You're not going to understand what the fuck's going on, but that's normal. You'll never understand what the fuck's going on unless you really dig into it in the Souls series. So it's a great place to start. It's an outstanding game. It's a little stuck in the shadows of its older brothers, but start with it first. So you don't have that comparison, and then you go back to the other ones and you can be like, wow, this is way better and way fucking harder. Oh my god, I gotta up my game. It's a solid 4 out of 5 game. You should absolutely play it. You should absolutely get it. Please support the series. Looking forward to Beast Souls, by the way. It will begin again. I'm looking forward to Beast Souls, seeing some gameplay at E3. I've heard might be happening. So we'll see about that. So, as always, guys, I'm Jay Griff. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening. And be careful out there. No one wants to see you go hollow.